Perfect, wonderful. I think we can start. Welcome, everyone. This is our Global Research and Policy Seminar series, and today's seminar is on the impact of global change on food trade vulnerability and food security. My name is Mihaela Papa. I'm Director of Research and Principal Research Scientist at MIT Center for International Studies. Today with us, we have our colleagues from Abdul Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab, or JWAFS, and I also wanted to thank JWAFS for co-organizing the event with us. Dr. Kenneth Strpek is the Climate, Water, and Food Specialist for MIT JWAFS and research scientist with MIT's Joint Program and the Center for Global Change Science. He has worked for a range of national governments, as well as the United Nations, the World Bank, the USAID. He's Professor Emeritus of Civil, Environmental, and Architectural Engineering at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He's also Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and an International Fellow at the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Dr. Gregory Six directs the Food and Climate Systems Transformation Alliance, an MIT JWAFS-led global network of leading research institutions and stakeholder organizations working to shorten the link between research and action. He's also the research manager for food and climate systems on various JWAFS projects. Previously, he worked at the US Department of Agriculture's National Institute of Food and Agriculture and has extensive consulting experience in agricultural innovation systems and at the Climate Food Systems Nexus. I'm particularly delighted to host Ken and Greg today because we also have a great collaboration through our BRICS lab. And particularly because today they will be talking to us about the work that they have been doing for a significant amount of time and have gathered an amazing data set, Jameel Index for Food Trade and Vulnerability. And we are now getting to see some of the patterns and to learn how we can actually work toward reducing food insecurity. So thank you so much for joining us. Please, the floor is yours.
Just want to say it's nice to be in Department of Political Science because I'm undergrad in political science, and I'd like to say I'm a political scientist in sheep's clothing, ultimately focusing on policy. So it's nice to be. I haven't been in a poli-sci department for a bit, so it's nice to have. Thanks for having us. So first and foremost, it's important to highlight that this Jameel Index did not happen as just me and Ken. It was a large team of incredible people coming from MIT JWAFS, IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute based in Washington, D.C. A lot of their models are integral to the Jameel Index. The Oxford Martin School, Colorado State University with our colleague Dana Hogue is here with us visiting. Colleagues from UAE University and support from Community Jameel. So it was a true team effort that brought us here over the last 3 years now. It's also important to define what we mean by food trade vulnerability. So what we're, for the concept of the discussion today, what we mean by that is the risk to food imports for a country based on a variety of factors. And we're going to unpack some of those factors momentarily. A couple key elements here. Food trade has been integral and central to achieving food security globally. It allows countries to highlight on what they produce best. It allows us to buffer risk when there's supply chain shortages, but it can also transfer risk throughout the global food trade system, which is increasingly interconnected and increasingly complex. So things such as trade disruptions, like a ship stuck in the Suez Canal, conflict, Ukraine-Russia, climate events can impact and have impact on food trade. Increasingly focusing on climate change as a risk factor. And to date, prior to the Jameel Index, there really was no central holistic way to look at these food trade vulnerability metrics, especially in an era since the WTO was launched in the mid-90s. There's been an increase in regional trade agreements, an increase in bilateral food trade between countries, and so the complexity's increased. And we haven't really had a good way in the past to look at, especially the bilateral trade component. One of the key elements of this is that our colleagues at IFPRI developed bilateral trade models to feed into this as well. So the Jameel Index is a composite index of 5 meta indicators. So their food and feed import dependency, so the amount of demand met for food and animal feed through importation, foreign exchange, so a country's ability to pay for its imports. So it's the exports of their entire economy and how that relates to their ability to import. Supply chain reliability, we look at the variability of yields in the exporting countries. And supply chain robustness is the number of countries that countries are getting their food imports from. The Jameel Index is a composite index, so it's integrating these 5 meta indicators in a geometric approach. And the geometric approach is important because if you think about this, think about heart disease or risk for a heart event. If you got high cholesterol, you smoke, you're obese, any single one of those can increase your risk. So even if you've got good in one area, a high risk in those can have an impact throughout the whole system. I'm not going to go too into the methodology today, so if you'd like to learn more, we've got a working paper up on the Jameel Index website. And so this is data from 2019. We wanted to look at pre-COVID. And you can see the difference between different countries here, and I'll unpack some of this. Some of these might seem surprising. Some of them might seem like they make sense, but this is the food trade vulnerability using the Jameel Index for over 180 countries. When you look at the percentage of global population, it actually looks like not much vulnerability. Things are doing pretty well. And when you think about that a little bit, it makes sense. A couple low vulnerability countries with high populations really kind of change the whole story. So we decided to really look in our analysis at the country level. Country levels where policy happens. You can see at the country level that food insecurity in one country can have regional repercussions, can cause geopolitical instability. So the country level is where we focused on our work. Just check one thing, trying to get next here. On the regional side, we look, Latin America and Oceania are the ones that exhibit the highest average food trade vulnerability. And just for the sake of discussion here, we deem medium and above as vulnerable based on this. And it's explained a bit more in the methodology paper, and we can dive into that during the Q&A if you'd like. So Oceania makes sense. Many island nations, you look at Australia, it's doing fine, but there's a lot of island nations that are highly dependent on imports. For Latin America, what's actually throwing off that is largely the Caribbean countries as well that rely on imports. The Asia is impacted largely by, Middle East is West Asia. So that actually pulls and increases the vulnerability. And much of Africa is influenced by North Africa, the dry areas. And this is where things start to get a little interesting here, is many of these sub-Saharan African countries look not very vulnerable. Well, they aren't largely vulnerable to food trade impacts because they're too poor to import. So when you look at food security elements of many of these countries, you can see that they're food insecure and not vulnerable to imports because they just don't have the means to pay for food imports. This graph has each of these shapes is a country, and the size is the population. So we started to look at analysis where you start to integrate in the relationship between food security and food trade. And there's a couple of things going on here. One is that there's 2 paths to food security. One is increasing self-sufficiency. And that's where, especially these countries on the upper left quadrant, they are highly food secure and low vulnerability in the Jameel Index. Many of these countries have the land mass and the resources to be able to produce domestically. The other path to achieving food security is through economic growth that allows you to import. And we see that in many of these smaller countries. The Gulf countries are a prime example of that. And so some of the key elements of this is that what this is starting to unpack is there's really no easy path forward to food security for low and lower middle income countries. There's a lot of narratives around improving self-sufficiency. If we're looking towards the middle of the century, a place like Uganda, whose population is going to double, I'm an ag guy. I'm very much so in favor of regenerative agriculture. Can we transition an entire agricultural system to regenerative sustainable production practices by 2050? I would be somewhat skeptical of that. So that then starts to look at a place like Uganda, whose population is going to double, if they're looking for self-sufficiency, what are the environmental impacts? You know, what is that? Which path is sustainable? It's going to, if you want to produce domestically, you need to increase your inputs. There's environmental impacts on that. If you're focusing on improving the economy to be able to import, then there's long-term planning. There's infrastructure development, there's economic development, energy, human capital investments. So where we think one of the valuable aspects of the Jameel Index is that it actually allows us to start to unpack and have these discussions on the right balance of things. And I'm going to now hand it over to the really interesting part, which is the future. And Ken's going to talk about that.
All right, well, thank you, Greg. So before I begin, any questions for Greg? A lot has been shared, this methodology. We'll give you a second to ask any questions as
In the back.
Do you take into account the climate change?
So that's actually what Ken's going to talk about today, climate change and broader global change. So what I presented, I realize now in hindsight, I didn't indicate that that was historical and current. And the most current we have is 2023 data we just got. So there's about a 2-year lag in the data. So everything that I presented to this point is historical and mostly current. And then we're also presenting some additional climate change and global change work on Wednesday at IFPRI in DC. It's a hybrid event and it'll be available online as well. And that's where we're just integrating that. In fact, the website's not even up to date yet with the climate change elements. But Ken's got some really interesting data on climate change he'll be discussing momentarily.
Thank you. I was wondering whether also different governmental organization membership is incorporated into this index, including the World Trade Organization. I think there's a separate treaty or clauses that governs food trade and security. So I was wondering whether that.
So we've got WTO members on the advisory board for this. We're only looking at the national level on this, but actually a lot of the bilateral trade and regional trade agreements occur outside of the global agreements that the WTO manages. So that's one of the cool parts about this index, is looking at that bilateral trade element that no one's done before. Any more questions? All right, sir, it's yours.
So what we're looking at here is all model, all models are wrong and some are useful. And so we're trying to look at how do you go forward in policy. And I think this room and the people here are where I have the biggest questions. You're going to see in a minute here, as we move forward, what Greg was looking at was looking backwards. Not that he's a backward looking guy, but we were looking at history and trying to understand patterns and how we got to where we are with food security and food trade. And all that's based on data, comes from 3 major sources: the Food Balance in Trade Matrices. ComStat is a UN organization, but sometimes the data is not there. And up the road, up at Harvard, Ricardo Halfsman and his group there, they have an atlas of economic complexity, and they did a lot of homework to get some of the data that in the raw state isn't there. They've done some work. So we pulled this all together, and then we looked at going from variables to that index, and we're able to look at that. But the big question in the future, which we get, is, as we talked to what should we do? So there is a debate. We made this presentation at one point, and the people wanted to throw me out of the room because we had this line that said imports, and they are against importing food as a measure. And they had it for the reason Greg was talking about, is they said anything but regenerative agriculture is a sin. And then on the other side there's the political side of conflict, which we see all the time in Africa, is if I'm not food self-sufficient, somebody can hold me liable to, or hold me hostage to food imports. And we just have to look at the history of that in, the US and Russia in 1980. Most of you weren't born then, but we had a grain embargo to Russia. And so food can be used as a weapon, so people are afraid. But then the big issue, and Clement sitting in the back of the room, who just completed his master's at ETH in Switzerland, looking at what are the issues of sustainability. So the problem is, how do you feed Africa, for example? We'll focus there. When their yields are so low, So you have an alternative of horizontal expansion, which is going after converting land, making land use change from forests or grasslands that we want to preserve into food project, or vertical expansion, which is putting inputs on fertilizer or pesticides, or heaven forbid using GMO products. So as we look at that, how do we make that happen? So Greg and I have had this dialogue back and forth, and the whole question is, if we look at the history of environmental movement throughout the US, there's a concept known as the environmental Kuznets curve, which is we go through, as we get wealthy, we pollute quite a bit. We don't pollute when we're very at the lower level, where we don't have imports, we're very sustainable. Then we go through this rapid growth where we're polluting, but then we get rich enough to pay the price to have sustainable agriculture and organic agriculture. But the question that happens in the development world is, what they want to know is, can we tunnel through the Kuznets curve? And this is, we're at COP now, and that's part of one of the things is people are saying, we want you to be carbon neutral, use these other things. But by the way, we're not going to pay it for it. You have to pay this extra to get there. And on the same time, we're blasting your climate, and your regular productions are going down. So most of the developing countries have a double risk: the risk of going to low carbon energy, and then at the same time, they're most vulnerable to climate change. So as we looked at that, we want to look forward, and as that little picture in the corner says, but what is the future? Anybody here be able to tell me? We want to know, right? What's the future? Short term, what's going to happen to our overhead rates, and long term, what's going to happen to the world? So what we've done is try to fit with what the community that's doing development is working on. And we talk about this as global change. So climate change is important, but climate change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not happening on what we are today. The climate is changing, and it's going to be hitting in 2050 a new world that isn't now. So we have to look at what that world in 2050 is going to be. And the way we do that is through scenarios. And so the most, we can come up with our own scenarios, but trying to be consistent in all the people in the world so we can compare our results to those of AgMIP and other people, is we want to use what the IPCC is using, which has done a lot of work on this. And we have what we call development pathways, SSPs. And so those look at economic growth and population growth by specific regions of the world with a story. So there's a very famous, the Shell scenarios, where you make a narrative and then you fit the narrative around it, and then you come to the detail. And then at the same time is how much carbon is going to be emitted for each of those scenarios. That's the RCP. And then those get put into climate models, and then you get that. So the problem is this explodes into uncertainty in the future. And what we're going to do today is we're just going to focus on some of that so we can see what's going on. So you get these futures. You have, as Greg said, Uganda is going to double its population in 20 years. What's going to happen in Botswana? These things. So we have consistent scenarios of population, and then consistent economic growth scenarios. And that's going to be certain emissions, and that comes to the climate models. So there's about 32 major climate models in the world. And even if we knew perfectly how much carbon would be in the air, we would still have 50% of the uncertainty of the future climate. And what's even worse is all of the climate models are giving the same direction of warming in terms of temperature. They vary from place to place. But precipitation, we have to give more money to the green building, to EAPS there, because the precipitation, we're not doing a good job yet in confining that. There's very much ranges of that. Even in Africa, 15 of the models are wet, 15 of the models show drying. So that's an uncertainty, and that itself is a big problem for the world. So what we did is work with IFPRI, which has a series of global models. And they, first of all, take the climates that are there and look at yields in 2050. They look at the progression of how temperature and precip changes will change yields of crops. And they have a model which has over 33 crops in them. And we look at how that's going to change in the future. Then there is economic growth in each of the countries and then there is a population growth. And you put those all together in an economic model. And basically, since the Sloan School's over there in the Department of Economics and about 10, Nobel Prizes in economics, they will be very mad. But we do supply and demand. Okay, that's what they do in that building over there. Supply and demand. What is the equilibrium? So we're projecting the increase in demand with population and economic growth, and then we're modeling the supply that's available. And what happens is if you increase the demand for the same supply, what happens to prices? They go up, okay? And so world market prices go up. So if somebody wants to buy that food, they're not going to be able to buy as much because the prices are. So that's all built into our model. And the way most of the global models run, they're either really big, like all of Africa, all of Asia, and they look out in detail, and they look at trade between these regions. But what really matters is bilateral trade between countries. So IFPRI went under this project and built what we call this bespoke model of bilateral trade. So they are able to model what's happening now and then the future. So one of the things that was just asked is these set of models are what we call, so they start out with, they come from climate models that are there with temperature and precip. Those goes into agricultural yield models. That then goes into the economic model. And in there is a full biophysical model of the water resources of the world at 380 different food producing units. And groundwater is in there. And then, excuse me, there is land use conversions. So everything's a scenario or a policy because it's the future. We don't know. So the beauty of models is that we can test things. Okay. And so in a 35-minute seminar, we're not going to show you a lot of those, but if somebody has a question or answer and we can get the team together, we can answer that question. Like, what if we got rid of all reservoirs in the world? Well, 45% of all grains in the world are irrigated. And about 40 of those percent are from surface water, the other from groundwater. What would that mean for the world if we got rid of all reservoirs? So we could look at that in this model. That's the kind of thing you can do. Or what if we don't, one of the questions was in Uganda, with doubling the population, we have to feed the people. They have a lot of wetlands. Okay, what's happening now is the wetlands have been reduced already by 50%. And we've shown the ecosystem service benefits from those. If they don't import food, they're going to just start going to the wetlands and start growing food in the wetlands. So that when we say self-sufficiency, at what cost? And it's usually the ecology and the ecosystems that are there. So yes.
Do you in your model, if at all, think about technological change?
Okay, in the IFPRI model, all yields in countries have a growth factor. They just recently updated it to 2020. So they've looked at the last 10 years of what has been the growth, and you knew it's coming. I didn't even pay her. The next two slides are related to that. So for example, the growth rate technologically of yields in Uganda has been about 1 or 2% because they still got the yield gap. Population growth at 3. Delta 2, what does that mean? So how do you increase that? It's usually with high inputs. And whereas Clements can have a seminar afterwards in the back room on what does it mean for doing that in those productions. So here's the big thing. What are we going to look at? So there are 5 major, what we call SSP social pathways, and there's the sustainability one, and most everybody agrees we're not on that. The rapid growth 5, we don't think we're on there. So somewhere between 2 and 3 is what people are looking at. So for this analysis, we're just going to look at the middle of the road. We can run all of them if one wants, but Michaela said we have to leave. I can't stay here till 5. So let's just look at what matters here. So this is the population projections for low-income countries. low-income countries are about, currently are about 600 million out of the population of 8 billion. So, you know, somewhere about 8 or 9% of the globe. And under SSP 2 and 3, the ones we're looking at, they double or get a little bit more than that. So there's going to be twice as many people in the low-income countries where the food production currently is pretty poor, and there's big yield gaps. And so, however, if we look at the lower middle income, and again, these aren't to the same scale, but it's a little bit scary. Under SSP2, we're adding 600 million more people of low income, but under SSP2 in the middle income, we're going from 3 billion to over 4 billion. So we're adding between those two 1.8 billion people, which have to be fed, because basically the rest of the world stays constant in the next 25 years. So we got to feed 1.8 billion people. And so how are we going to do that? Well, that and economic growth, because these countries are still growing. And one of the things in the model is your diet is tied to your income. And so one can look at diet changes. And that's one thing IFPRI is doing on another project, is looking at diet changes. But if we then go and look at climate change, so we have this population growing 1.8 billion people, but this is part of the issue, and I'm not sure everyone fully understands, but by 2050, we don't have the big catastrophic changes that can happen. And all the different pathways from the 8.5 to the 1.2, they're all kind of bunched by 2050. So the big things happen at the end of the century. However, when you talk to the private sector, they're looking 2 years to 5 years. You're talking the planners in developing countries are looking maybe 10 to 20. If you're building a dam, it's 75 years, but the economics drop out. So no one's really planning to the end of the century. So we've just been involved with what the World Bank has been doing called the Country Climate Development Reports. And they're looking only to 2050. And every time we would show this curve, this graph, no matter what, saying you living on the edge of danger, because if you plan for 2050 and you think it's going to stay there, it's going to change after that. It isn't leveling at 2050, it's continuing. So what's going on in COP and these discussions are really important, because you could maladjust for where you are for 2050, which isn't what's there now. So we have to take a look and see what's happening. Now, we're going to take the overall picture and look and what happens in global change. Well, if we look at the Jameel Index, we classified them by very low, low, medium, high, and extreme. And this is, if we look at 2050 under global change with SSP2, only 1% of the countries move down 2. So 1% get better in the Jameel Index. By 2 units, 6% get better by 1. So they either go from extreme to high, or high to low, high to medium there. But 64% stay the same, but 22% go 1 higher, 5% go 2 higher, and 2% go 3 higher because of what's going on. Now, the interesting thing is, if we look at climate change in 2030, where we look at what would be the climate change impact on top of this, what's the delta change? 94% of them stay the same. So what's happening here, if we can look over at where it says future there at 2050, is that adding $1.8 billion, 1.8 billion people is such a shock to the food system. That's driving it. And what's happening to climate change is 2 things. If a country like Uganda is producing 2 tons per hectare of a grain, there's going to be technological change. And let's say that in that time we can get to 3. So they're doing better by 50%. Climate change by that time is only hitting it by about 10%. The climate change are not catastrophic. That 10% important, But if you look at 2050, it's actually better. So instead, it's now at 2, it'll go to 3.6 instead of 4. You're still doing better. You're not doing as well as you could, and you're not doing as well as what you need. So that's why this is a complex system of what's going on. So when we look at this, and then everybody's ready here. Okay, good. I mean, everybody's going to need this for your next slide because you couldn't have done this on an empty stomach. And I apologize to Danny because we call this the spaghetti diagram, but no offense towards Italian Americans or Italians in the room. But this is what's happening in 2050 with no climate change. And the green dots are 2020 and the red dots are where they are at 2050 on the same graph that Greg was talking about. So what is happening globally? And in the middle here, oh, I think I can get a laser pointer. Here we go. Yeah, so in the middle here is the mean. It's going from here to here. So the globe is tending to have going from a medium Jameel to a little bit higher, and food security index is going up as well. But you see, things are going in all different directions in the future. So this is hard to pull out, but if we look at it down here, the mean of food security, we're going from a 0.65 to 0.71. And that 0.7 is about the, below 0.7 is about medium below. So we're getting to a high, not very high yet. So this is a good thing globally, but the Jameel goes up about 10% for the globe. But that doesn't tell us the story for policy. The global numbers don't mean anything. What we have to do is to look at, we seeing the, oh, good, you're still seeing, I'm seeing it. So let's look at,
So this last change.
oh,
here, I think you gotta go.
see, oh, and I got that one.
We needed the pointer kind of.
Pointed the pointer.
There we go.
Okay. Okay, so this is low income. So what you notice here is some major shifts, but almost all of the low income countries are going from a low Jameel to a higher Jameel in order to get increased food security. So that's that import arrow that Greg talked about. And so it brings us to this question is this something that's normative that we want to accept? Second, can they even do it? How do you pay for your imports? So there's a development question as well as a moral question and a ecological question, because the other side is you may, if you want to go back this way and be self-sufficient, this is a controversial, I'll say carte blanche, don't copy it, but basically it's going to be at the expense of the environment, one way or the other. We got to increase yields. We're going to cut forests. We're going to use wetlands, or we're going to put a lot of fertilizer, or we're going to use GMO. We're going to do something. Somebody's not going to be happy, one way or the other. How do we get that? And that's not a huge, now what you see is they're going from 0.27 to 0.37. That's almost a, a 30 to 40% increase in foods in the Jameel Index, and they're getting about 11% increase in food security. So what are we caring about in the future? What does society want? Food security, or we want to, if the cost of it is going to be vulnerability? What does a decision maker want? That's the question, for the room. If we look at low, something went on anyway, this is low middle income, and I think it's it's a fight between Apple and Microsoft. So this is low middle income, and they're going up not as much in the HB, not percentage wise, but they're going up pretty substantial in the Jameel Index, and it's again towards the upper quadrant there, with an import path to get there. We then look at upper middle income, and that's a different story. Jameel doesn't change at all on average. And the HDMI goes up because basically they're producing, they have the technology, the human capital to increase their yield. So basically under the hood, their yields are going up much faster than the others. So they can supply their own food and even be exporting. So that's what they're doing with that. And then we come and look at, here's the high income countries, and basically they're going backwards. Their Jameel, they dropped from 0.27 to 0.26. And I have to say, none of this has no relationship to recent tariff analysis. Is not in this. But basically, you see, they're already doing well. They go up a little bit because the world market prices, they're doing well, that they can sell their food. Because basically that upper quadrant that Greg was talking about, that's high income, and that they're super exporters. The exporters in the world are North America and Europe and Argentina and Brazil. It's this switch. The industrialized countries are now the super exporters because they use high inputs, their yields are high. We have much more food than we need, so we put it on the world market. So, yes.
If we were today in 1975 or 2000, so 25 years period, and we would do the same analysis looking towards the year 2000 or towards the year 2025, how would the analysis look like in comparison to what really happened? Like, how much can we really predict how would things look like 25 years from now, even if we use all the data that we have?
Question.
Really good question. We did this study for Egypt. Okay, so I did a retrospective study of the High Aswan Dam for Egypt. When the High Aswan Dam was being planned, they expected half of the benefits to come from hydropower and half of the benefits to come from agriculture. Between 1970, when that came online, and now, the price of energy has gone up 20-fold. The price of agriculture has dropped until recently coming up. So 90% of the benefits are energy and 10% agriculture. So basically, the colleagues of Dana have done too good a job.
That seems like the opposite by what you're saying.
Well, for the world, I mean, the growth in yields with the CG centers and all these things, now the thing we're noticing is they're starting to go back up, the prices of food. We've hit some limits here, but basically agriculture production has gone up. The prices have gone down on food, and that's what's driving this. What's the number of the last 20 years? 3 times the yield?
I forget, but the yield gains are starting to plateau out. So that's a very good question, because it would be really interesting to run this retrospectively and see where we are.
Because what I understand from your answer is that predictions are very,
Yeah.
I don't know what's the word to use.
No, that's why you have to use, you have to do scenarios. I mean, you have to, and then what you have to do, and we all do this, what do we think the next 5 years is gonna be? Even as academics, if you're a young should I stay doing my PhD? We live in a world of uncertainty. We make decision-making under uncertainty. Do we do things that are robust? Do we take risks? What do we do? So that's the issue. And having a tool, we can go sample different things and look for what we call robust solutions. What's the solution? And generally what we do in that world is we minimize our maximum loss. We don't try to get our gains. We're looking at what we don't want to lose a lot. So we minimize the losses we would have rather than maximize our gains. So policymakers want to look at this. If I do this, what could happen to me? And so we're working with the government of South Africa right now as they're trying to understand what's their risk to climate change. They want to go to net zero carbon. That's going to cost them 1% of GDP in the next 30 years. But at the same time, climate change, so they're helping the world. They want to be net, but climate change is giving them a 2% loss in their GDP from everybody else's carbon. So should they give up, or should they keep doing it? Should somebody give them the 1% that they're helping the globe? So it's a very complex thing, but at least these kind of tools can help us think and have a dialogue, because they're wrong. They're wrong, but what do you do? But basically, in terms of water, we did a retrospective study. Peter Glick at the Pacific Institute did it. He looked at 1975 predictions of water use in 2025. And all of them were through the roof, assuming irrigation was going to continue at the level it was back in 1975. So we leveled at about 2,000 of those predictions. They were about right to 2,000. But the environmental movement, the yields going up in these areas. So yeah, those are good, fun questions. But in the absence of that, we'd rather have a model that we can test and dialogue with than, just hearsay and opinion. Now, go
And
ahead.
one thing that's key is the models that we're integrating for this are models that have been around for a while. So they've been applied, like, we aren't creating new models, we're integrating them in new ways. So we've got a lot of data as these models have been developed and improved. That's the nice thing about this, we aren't creating, and like we're standing, as Ken said, we're standing on the shoulders of giants with IFPRI's models and things like that are highly used and have a pretty good track record.
Most of IFPRI's models were funded by USAID, may they rest in peace, and recently the Gates Foundation, and then the World Bank. And so they've been used for policy. And so that's where we're going on Wednesday to show this and some more data. But if we look here on Africa, we can see Africa is going towards imports. And so this is the opening of our paper with Mihaela, is now that there's BRICS. Ethiopia's in BRICS, Egypt's in BRICS, the S in BRICS is South Africa. What does this mean? How are they going to look to import from the US? I've been there the last year. They're turning away. They are not pleased. They are worried about what's going on, and they're looking for something else. And then the other thing is, we can get into the detail. One of the things that's driving this Jameel Index going up is this foreign exchange element. So you have, the way we look at this risk is, what's your total exports and what percentage of your exports are imports for food? And those are going up in almost every African country. So the models allow you to take it, but foreign exchange for macroeconomists are one of the most things that limit your economy from growing. Because if you want to bring in technology, you want to bring in computers and these things, they don't make it themselves. You want to bring in cars, you have to pay for that with foreign exchange. And if you're spending it on food, you can't grow your other capital or other things. So that's where this risk is coming up, besides the imports growing themselves. So those two things are really important. And one of the things the BRICS is doing is they're talking about this grain exchange, where they may let you buy grain with your local currency. And if they do that, that's basically the consortium is going to take the hit economically to build friendships and allow Uganda and others to pay for food. An example is, we did a project with a consulting firm in Cambridge. We worked for Uganda, 15 months to be paid for an invoice because it was foreign exchange. They had plenty of money to hire us in shillings, but when they went to pay us, they couldn't get dollars to pay us. So we had to go on leave. We were for 1 year, we were off looking at how to improve food security in the country. We couldn't look at it for a year because they hadn't paid us. We had to go on hold. So these are real things that are hitting here. And then this is the issue, this is a little bit off here, but climate change is not making a big impact by 2050. What's making the impact is this global change in 1.8 billion people on the earth. And it's even more if you go to SSP 3, 4, and 5, just a little bit less with SSP 1, which is almost, very unlikely. So the issue by 2050 is not the climate change. Where you see catastrophic climate change is due to the concept ecologically of tipping points and thresholds. There are these temperatures, like corn won't grow after 102 degrees, and we don't have the new varieties for it. So you get to this point where then you just can't grow anymore in a certain country. Those happen 2030, 2075, 2080, towards the end on those upper ones. So they're there and they're real. But what happened a while ago is the World Bank did a study, and they looked at 2100 with the hottest scenario, and they call it turning down the heat, which scared the world, but it's so far from now and what to do is, do you plan for something, this catastrophic thing in 75 years? The private sector's not doing it. Policymakers care about next week. So how do we do this properly and look at that? So the finding was, I think what we said, it's vulnerability is due to population and economic growth in the next 25 years. The climate change impacts are there locally. There's going to be some place that the climate change has gone over a tipping point in some part of Botswana or some other areas, or particularly what people are really worried about are pests coming in that we don't know yet, as it doesn't affect the yield, but other aspects of the growing has happened. But also, like I said, there's autonomous economic adaptation where even countries that are poor, they're increasing their yields slowly, so they're still better off in 2050, but not as well off as they could be. And those kind of things are what's happening here. So thank you very much. If you're interested and have nothing to do on Wednesday, we're going to present this again, but from a different spin. And what really cool about this one on Wednesday is my tag team partner here, Greg, is going to lead a panel of experts. Paula de Almeida from Pegasus Capital, who's a private sector, is going to talk about what this means for investment. Ruth Hill, who's the head of trade at IFPRI, is going to be there talking about what this means in light of trade, where she's a world's expert on trade. And then Mark Rosegrant, who developed these tools and these models for IFPRI over the last 30 years, is going to talk about your question of, can we believe the models? So that should be fun, and that'll be next week, but not as nice food. We're just going to have some pastries in the beginning, but not as healthy as this.
No.
So any questions we have? We talked a lot. You're
This
welcome.
was wonderful, so thank you. Please just raise your hand and introduce yourself.
Yes. Lisa Harley, thank you so much. This is such an amazing amount of work to put all this data together. So thank you. I guess I'm wondering is when you look at the countries that are the vulnerable ones, the ones at the end, and you try to look at, like, if you're advising each of them, would you be telling them a similar story about what their best bets are, or are the stories very different across countries?
Stories are there are three things that we have to do, and they come, one is A and B. Human capital development, no matter what, education is the most important thing. Because the only way you're going to be able to either grow the economy to be able to buy food or to develop your food itself is having an educated population. The B of that is educating women, which are, or girls at that point, is most important, because we've seen that throughout the sector, particularly in water and other things, is the girls, it happens two ways. And we've studied this, the economic impact. The girls are the water gatherers, and they don't go to school because they're gathering water. So if we bring in water supply, it helps on the education. The other side is they generally are making the household decisions later on, and in the subsistence and are doing the farming. So we need to bring that in, but then general education is on the other side. So that's human capital in all senses, and then infrastructure. So the big thing that we're hoping, and we got discussions going on, is Africa. Bill Gates wants Africa to be a net food exporter by 2050. We're given the opposite side. So we're talking to his chief agricultural person saying, how are we going to do that? And then the other problem is across the campus at the Center for Sustainability, Science and Strategy, Jen Morris has been looking at what are the ways of getting to net zero in the globe from economics. And that's using Latin American and African agriculture for carbon sequestration. Right. So that's going to fight for land, for water, for food. So solving the North's climate problem on the South is going to hurt the South. So to me, it's this whole moral issue. But a country like Botswana, they're very vulnerable, but they have diamonds. And so what they do is they've been very careful to take this concept of intrinsic wealth and use their capital to make them resilient for the future. So so what you do in Botswana is going to be different what you do in Mozambique, what you're going to do in other countries. And then the whole thing of how do we move forward, and I think Greg said it, is we can't get to where we want to be linearly. We're not going to get to regenerative agriculture tomorrow. We're going to have some path, and whether that's importing or not. But then the other countries I'm going to my favorite conference ever in the world in January, the World Chocolate Conference in London. Fasting for a month before I go. But the exporters of coffee and cocoa, 80% of the countries of where they're produced, they're exported. They're worried about what's going to happen. So these countries that are agriculturally dependent for their export income, how's climate change going to affect them? So we're looking in phase 2 for funding to look at exports and export vulnerability, because that's going to be really important.
And some of that export stuff is really fascinating because when you look at things like coffee and chocolate, you've got a lot of microclimate variability. And in some of these places, we don't have the rich enough data to be able to model that on the microclimates that we have. And then also in some places, like for instance, we know about half the area that Ethiopia produces coffee on now, by the latter part of the century, won't be able to produce coffee. It's gonna probably go up in elevation. There's already stuff where they might grow. And that's where some of the data starts to get tricky. And that's where you have to use, case by case, you bring in the expertise where you can. It might mean that in some places you need to fill the gaps. So as Ken said earlier, all models are wrong, some are useful. This is useful for some planning, but it's one of the arrows in a quiver. And the approaches for finding solutions need to be multi-dimensional, multi-tool based, multi-arrows, I guess, in that quiver, to stick with that analogy.
The thing that worries me, and Dana's here, and some people got married in Colorado, so they know, but we all of a sudden, we get the pine beetle. Now, whether that was climate change or variability that brought it in, we lost all these trees. I don't think we understand quite yet pests. So maybe they'll come before 2100. Those are just sort of water supply things. So maybe 2050, 2070, they're going to be these flips that are going to happen. So I'm not optimistic when I show these climate change. So that's what the models are saying. And Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House, who came from Cambridge, Massachusetts, he said all politics are local. And as Greg said, all climate change is local. We have to zoom down, but the one important thing is the ag world has a world market. And you've got to model the globe, because if you do a study of Botswana and don't understand what's going on in other places for world market prices, you're going to make bad decisions. So you got to have all of these. And part of the Jameel Index is we worked with, and this is sad, we were planning to do Sudan and Ethiopia as case studies. Sudan is in a terrible way, so we moved to Malawi. So we're looking at detailed studies of Malawi and Ethiopia, and what does this mean at a country level and also across income classes? Because how does the food get imported? It might just stop at the capital. And then how does this mean anything to the rural community? How are they the vulnerable ones just as food, never mind that food doesn't get there. And then the other thing, we're working with the Economic Commission for Africa. They want to look at intra-Africa trade as best they can, but they have no roads and no rail. So the infrastructure needs to be built on that. So a lot of things that this can be used. One, the other is, where might we need to be making ports? If we're going to be changing who's importing and who's exporting, how might we think about port development?
One other thing I want to highlight too is on the graph where we look at, things look pretty stable in 2050. Soon after 2050, things go, well, they actually would go more north than south if you use that
Yes.
orientation. But yeah, they don't go well, right? And so one of the things that we are hoping to drive the conversation of is, many of these models were developed to look up to 2050, starting 20 years ago. So now it's time to update for the next 20 years, right? But we're still working with models that we're predicting the future, but the future keeps getting closer and closer. So it does, this isn't to say we're all good by 2050. It's to say, okay, well, from an adaptation perspective, by the middle of the century, things aren't as bad as you might have thought. But when you look beyond that, and we're trying to encourage the model developers to really earnestly look beyond that, things can get really scary quite fast.
The scary thing is, to put it in current events, the funding of these things, the sources that we're funding these things are evaporating rapidly. USAID, who is funding these things, IFPRI's looking for the money to take the model to 2100. The CG Center is being cut, the World Bank's being cut, there's no USAID. The Europeans are funding, I'm going in your area, sorry, but there's taking their money from development to put it into military spending. So where are the funding? It's gonna have to come from philanthropic organizations right now. We don't see it happening in the next 4 or 5 years, the funding coming in those that are needed for these tools to look to the next step.
Wonderful. So thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our speakers. We have our next Global Research and Policy Seminar in the Bush Room in 2 weeks' time, and we're doing COP debriefing. So I hope you can join us. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.